I'm Peyton, director and publisher of Trinity University Press. Thanks for joining us for the Maverick Book Club. The books we discuss in this series explore the rich stories of Texas, but in this first season, we're focused on our hometown of San Antonio. You can look forward to a mysterious, provocative even look at life during World War II, a lively discussion with one of the city's most endearing and creative artists, an exploration of the known and sometimes left out history of the city left through the lens of vintage postcards, and a celebratory bounce through the culturally diverse day-by-day history of the city in San Antonio 365. So enjoy yourself, ask questions, and at the end, don't forget to check out the book we'll all be reading and talking about next month, available at a special price for club members. Thanks again for joining us, and see you next time.
Let's begin our conversation this evening, and I want to welcome remarkable writer herself, Jenny Davidson, to the Maverick Book Club tonight. She teaches in the English and Comparative Literature Department at Columbia University. She's authored 8 books, 4 of which are novels, 4 of which are works of literary criticism, and she has a new one about to be out called Broken Things, My Father, Edward Gibbon, and the Ruins of Rome. She spends a lot of time on social media where she reports regularly on running, yoga, cats, and all things made out of sugar, which if it had been chocolate, I would have said I loved her forever, but sugar's not bad. It's pretty close. And so one of the amazing things that she has brought forward for us and is the source of our conversation tonight is a new novel, not written by her, but by her step-grandmother, a novel that was found, or rather lost, and then found, and now brought out by Trinity University. In a way, it's a coming-of-age story about a protagonist in a city that is also coming of age. San Antonio in the 1940s is a very different place than it is now, but the city in the 1940s was very different than it had been in the 1930s. So it's a really explosive moment in a young woman's life at a time in a city that is just blowing out of the seams. And in my own family's life, my father actually trained at Fort Sam and at Kelly Airfield during that period of time. And the one piece of evidence that I have of his experience there were the letters that he wrote home to his family in Chattanooga, every single one of which had a return address that was different, which meant that he was moving around the town in ways that the protagonist does, even though she's centralized at a hotel. So Jenny, this is a remarkable project, a great coming of age story. And one of the things you say in your introduction is that Jane Davis's voice is not unlike Holden Caulfield and not unlike Sylvia Plath, or at least if we're thinking about 50s characters, 40s, 50 characters, those are the ones that one would turn to. Why? Like, what makes her like them in some fashion?
Well, it's really that first person voice. This is a novel that is told by its own main character. And that's such a distinctive feature of many of my favorite books over centuries, not just in that particular period. So there's a really distinctive combination. It's a flat affect, you know, a little bit deadpan, owing something to those noir narrators who were too cool to show any emotion, you know, about anything that they're experiencing. There's always a sense of humor. Sometimes it's so deadpan that you don't even quite know that there's a joke there. So, and a sense of real psychological dislocation as well. That, I think, would be in the end why I would especially want to group Margaret's narrator Jane with the narrators of the Bell Jar or of some of the Salinger stories.
Yeah, so dislocation. How was she dislocated?
So Margaret, the author of this book, had a truly extraordinary upbringing. She was born to a woman called Agnes Olson. That was her unmarried name. And Agnes had grown up in cotton country in West Texas. And essentially when she was 17 or 18, she told this story often later in life. I've heard this directly from relatives. She said, I don't want to be a slave to these farmhands, and essentially took off for Chicago, which was an extraordinary destination for people all over the country in the late 20s and 1930s. So she was living on the sort of bohemian fringes in Chicago during the 20s and 30s. She worked in tea shops as a server. She got into this business of running these small scale flop houses. I was struck by your wording when you said Jane Davis is living in a hotel. Yes, absolutely. Jane is living in a hotel, but it's not a hotel like, you know, the Hyatt Regency.
Right.
It's a little hole in the wall. Margaret's mother would rent out premises, you know, maybe a floor of a building, something like that. She rented essentially to men only. A character in the novel says, and again, it was something that Margaret's mother would often say, renting to women cheapens the place. And there's this sense that, you know, prostitution is always on everyone's mind in these boarding house contexts. In the hotel that Jane's mother runs in the novel, which is very closely based on some of these hotels that Agnes ran in the real world, we get this hint of the danger that lurks around every corner, and that, you know, you could get raped on the way to the bathroom. It's a precarious environment. And Margaret wasn't actually raised by her mother. Her father died when she was very young, and she was essentially brought up by hosts of different relatives. Agnes would take Margaret, show up somewhere, leave Margaret with a family, you know, come back only 6 months later. She would send Margaret letters, but it was a very peripatetic upbringing. And Margaret's husband, Jean, who I knew very, very well, Margaret's husband, Jean, said that Margaret went to 12 different schools from 1st grade to 12th grade. And that for her, the only real continuity was school itself, because there wasn't anything like a continuous home life.
Wow. And in many ways, that's actually not unlike the San Antonio in which Jane Davis finds herself, right? This place is surging. And what I love about the novel, and also about what you and Laura Hernandez-Erisman talk about, is this place that is vibrant, yes, but also churning with racial concerns, and sort of this young woman trying to find her way in a world that is clearly dominated by men, especially men in uniforms, and not really being able, not unlike Margaret, to sort of find her foothold, right? To find a place where that's hers. There's no room of her own.
I had a really wonderful exchange with one of my own students, a graduating senior this spring. So if you'll humor me, I'll tell a roundabout tale that might take a few minutes to get to the end point.
Please.
So the day that I received my author copies of The Duchess of Angus in the mail was in the 2nd week of March. And it was 2 days after the president of Columbia had just announced that we were taking 2 days of classes canceled, and that subsequently classes, you know, immediately, but probably for the whole rest of the semester, would be online. So it was a funny moment. I had this amazing box of beautiful books that I wanted to show to somebody, but we kind of weren't supposed to be on campus. I needed to take a copy to drop off for an editor at the Columbia Record who was going to do an interview piece on it. But I thought, I'll just take one extra copy. Maybe I'll see someone whose hands I can press it into. So I went and did it. I was aware that this was the last time I was going to be doing live office hours for a long time. It hadn't been actually prohibited. So there I was in my office, felt very silly. Nobody came by, but near the end of the time, a really wonderful senior in one of my seminars, her name is Giselle, came by, and we had a great conversation about how crazy and complicated and what was happening, all of that sort of thing. And as she left, I said, Giselle, you're clearly the person who is meant to have this book. I bought a copy for someone. I gave it to you. So she sent me a series of emails as she read it. She was essentially kind of evicted from the Columbia dorms not long after, went home to San Diego, California. And the book had a powerful effect on her, because like her, Jane also was a recent college graduate. going to a home that no longer felt quite like home, with no clear job prospects or what exactly was going to happen next. And so the story really captivated her, but with an interesting twist, because Giselle is from a family of Latino immigrants to the US. And so in some ways, as much as there was a strong identification as she read the book, there were moments of really being cast out from the world of the book, because this novel is very much of its time in bad ways as well as good ways. There's a sense there that the Mexican-American characters in the book, they're really only characters around the edges. They're not major figures in any real sense. You know, they sort of provide, Jane sees Mexican Americans on buses, or, you know, they populate the streetscape that she's in, but she's not having any meaningful interactions with people outside of her own little group of the same ethnicity and social class. So it was fascinating. It was powerful to me to hear Giselle's testimony about the ways that the book still worked for her. And we both shared, I think, we were moved by a sense of sadness that those aspects, these sort of really implicit racial prejudices that are there in this book, as in so many others of that period, are still actually a much stronger feature of life in today's United States than one would have imagined.
Right, and otherwise Giselle wouldn't have had that reaction. Right. If it seemed old and beyond her time, she might have read the book differently. But you know, and also she lives in the borderlands, so that there's also that element to it, which is not unlike San Antonio in its own way. So there are lots of places that really sort of jumped out at me. But I'm wondering also, because you talk about it in your intro, and it sort of is thematically flows through the text. Jane reads a lot. And she reads eccentrically, or so it seems to me. Like, who reads John Stuart Mill, right? I mean, really. But she does. And reads John Dos Passos, who I adore, but not many people read him any longer. And so I'm sort of curious how you, as a literary critic and a novelist yourself, how you sort of see these books filtering through the text, and what, if anything, they sort of evoked in you.
So Dos Passos is an interesting place to start, because I completely agree with you. You know, I've read the USA trilogy, but you know, I'm a professional academic. That's not really that surprising.
Exactly.
It was many years ago, I must confess. But we can easily forget that in the 40s, especially, Dos Passos, you know, he was probably the literary hero that people like Margaret and her later to be husband Jane and so forth most idolized. And there are other writers of that period that we don't tend to think about now too often either. Clifford Odets would be another name that would really come to mind there, right? So I think Dos Passos, he really was the American modernist writer, sort of alternative to Hemingway, more highbrow, more art-centered and so forth, like the American Joyce, something like that, you know?
Right.
The homebred Joyce, with a kind of vision for what the novel could be and what literature could be, that was inspiring to readers of a generation younger than he was. So I don't think I would say that Margaret's own prose or narrative structure is in any obvious way influenced by Dos Passos, but it's clear that for Jane, the character in the book, as I know it was for Margaret and for Jane and for many others of that generation, that Dos Passos was a real, like a beacon of some sort. Now, the reading that Jane is doing is not Dos Passos, I think, but a lot of the things that she mentions that she's reading in the book are assigned for the classes that she's taking locally. So she's somebody who's graduated from college, but her intellectual and personal home is really in literature, and she's attracted to literature in an academic setting. She's torn, though, in a way, she's not yet detached from her past self of college student. And in fact, in the book, although we hear her talk about her classes a lot, and she's reading Keats or amazingly Gammer Gurton's Needle, I think that's the funniest and most random thing. You know, she's reading pre-Shakespearean drama and the Romantic poets in a classroom context. But the world that she's in, it's sort of slow-paced, seductive, alcohol-steeped social world that she's in. It's a lure that's pulling her away from the classroom. So we more often see her not going to class because she's hungover, or speculating about whether her hangover will prevent her from being able to read Keats.
Just like a college student. I mean, it's perfect.
It's very It certainly was one of the things that I thought as I initially got to know this book was I thought, gosh, it's amazing how modern the sensibility and life of Jane Davis is. It feels very familiar to me since I'm someone who works very closely and really gets to know lots of people in their late teens and early to mid 20s. It felt very true to me, not least in the fact it's sort of, the book is really a small scale meandering coming of age story of a very delightful kind. It doesn't really have exactly a plot or a through line, but one of its small scale through lines is that Jane is ashamed because she's 21 years old and she's still a virgin. And throughout the book, she's on a sort of quest to try and lose her virginity, although she bumps up against the problem that these cadets that she's dating, the air cadets who are stationed in the airfield, in the numerous airfields around San Antonio in that period, that they have an idea of her as sort of a nice girl, a good girl that you don't do that sort of thing with. And she finds that humorously frustrating.
Yes. Well, and it's also humorous to read, right? She's trying to seduce this guy and he finally says, somebody's going to want to marry you, or something along those lines. And and she's sort of brought up by the joke of her own context and her own situation. And I think part of what is so striking about the protagonist and her relationship to the city is also, for me as someone who really loves San Antonio, is just watching her navigate the downtown corridor, which is pretty constrained. I mean, she does not venture far away from places that most San Antonians would know now. I mean, obviously some of the clubs have disappeared, but the streets are the same. And you know, part of what struck me about the novel is that she comes in on a Greyhound bus from Toledo, I guess, and yet there's very little movement after that point, outside of walking. I mean, there's a trip down to Kelly Airfield, I think, at one point, but she's pretty anchored, and in the anchoring, that's partly, I mean, she's pulling against the very tether that's holding her in that place. And it's pretty clear she wants to be liberated, but hasn't figured out quite how to do that and what the costs of it would be.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I had a really lovely trip to San Antonio. Once the book was going to be published, I wanted to go and talk to some family members who had stories and so forth. So I stayed, you know, in one of the little hotels on the Riverwalk, and it let me walk around and so forth. And I have to say that I was really delighted, both practically and in an idealistic sense, by how the fact that you could still walk to the Greyhound bus stop.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm a New Yorker, I'm a non-driver. So I was going after that to Austin, where one of my brothers lives with his family. So I walked from my hotel to the Greyhound station. I got on a bus. And of course, getting off in Austin, it's a completely different experience now, right? It's the sort of random side of the highway, you know, bus
it's
station.
It's
that's
crazy.
Effectively the main one. So I think San Antonio has held on to the feel of that downtown in a really wonderful way.
Yeah, and I'm sort of interested in other ways where you're sort of seeing this character and the way she I mean, because she has an unusual relationship with her friend Wade. It's actually for me, one of the most intriguing parts is this fraught but not really fraught relationship between these two characters. And I wonder if you could give us some characterizations of it and sort of how you, again, as a novelist, sort of watched this thing unfold and got a feel for how these two young women are responding to the world around them.
In a minute, I'll read a passage that
Please.
conveys both the
Yes.
feel of moving around San Antonio and the fascinating nature of the relationship between these two women. So yes, it's a male-dominated world. The city is swarming with cadets. Like, there are more than you can even count or remember, you know. And as you know, demographically, that really was the case. So
Yeah,
that's
hundreds of
conveyed
thousands.
effectively in the novel. But interestingly, I'd say almost all of the main characters here are women. There are
Yeah,
two older
right.
women, Martha, the hotel owner, and her friend Lily Delac, who runs the coffee shop in the hotel.
Right.
And then the real interesting relationship that develops or doesn't develop. There's a scene near the end where the two young women are sleeping in a bed together, and Jane says, "And we were friends for the first time." And I described this passage to a friend of mine who specializes in lesbian fiction of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and said, "Do you think that they've had sex in that scene, and that it's just the decorum of the time that you don't say that?" And she pointed out what I really knew myself, which is to say, the thing that fascinates us about this topic in literature is its sheer undecidability. The point is, all of those scenes in books where there's a strong emotional connection between two women and there's some kind of an intense physical and emotional encounter, we honestly just, the text does not give us the information that we would want to have in order to establish like this sort of, and that would be the thing where if you were doing a TV or film adaptation, the director would be able to make a choice about what do we see, you know, what do we see when that's happening. But let me read this scene. It's relatively early in the novel, and it really nicely conveys, as I said, both the sense of place and this really important relationship between these two young women. Although the Easter season came early that year, it did not bring with it the abrupt emotional uplift that I had always associated with that time. This was due in part to the soft, warm climate. Here, we did not need a promise of spring, of better things ahead. We never lost them in a cold, gray winter. Except for a half-hearted blizzard, which might last anywhere from an hour to 2 days, and emptied the stores and streets and discontinued transportation, we lived in a fragrant tropical garden. Then, too, we were in the midst of a war. We were living as nearly as possible at a constant peak of excitement. There was a song in our hearts in those days. True, it was a melancholy song, but an affected melancholy, tempered by confidence, and we enjoyed everything about it. As I left the store the Saturday before Easter, I was very much aware of the time, the place, and the moment. In the half block from Joski's of Texas to the Alamo, 3 cadets, a pair of sergeants, and 1 stunning second lieutenant made futile stabs at last-minute Saturday night dates. But the night was young. I felt hot and messy, and Wade Howell, this is Jane's friend, had a crazy notion about hunting for confetti eggs in the Mexican Quarter. That morning, when she handed me the advertising copy for the sports shop, I found a little note clipped to the top sheet. It was marked personal. Of course it was from Wade Howell. Even Joski's art department would go to pieces if its artists handled their pencils with such a tight, elementary grip. And certainly it was for me. She didn't speak to anyone else in sportswear. Reading the note, I couldn't avoid feeling a little quiver of annoyance. Why should I be destined to jump and run anytime this strange girl saw fit to turn her smooth young head in my direction? I was tempted to refuse the invitation when it occurred to me that all I had to look forward to that night was a date with Tad Withers. Then, too, the notion that I was indebted to Wade Howell sucked at me like a leech. I pictured, not entirely unhappily, a blackmail that would go on forever. I found Wade Howell posed before a display of antique silver. Dark hair, dark glasses, white dress, the cool lady of mystery on the hot streets of a southern city. She looked satisfied. "Let's freshen up," she said. I didn't mention the fact that we were only 3 blocks from the Angus. Instead, we pushed past 5 blocks of soldiers to the St. Anthony Hotel. In the ladies' lounge, she pulled off her dress, kicked off her shoes, and ran a basin of water all at once. On the mirrored door, there were flimsy depictions of languorous mermaids floating among seaweed that looked curiously like cacti. In a futile attempt to be modern, the artist had disjointed the mermaids so that the effect was more pitiful than decorative. But for an instant, when Wade Howell stood before the mirror, the painting took on the sensuous quality that was intended. One of the fishtails fitted perfectly on her torso. Startled, I let out a little gasping sound before I had time to catch myself. She must have noticed, for she turned her head slightly to give her shoulders and breasts a more seductive quality. Come home with me tonight and we'll swim in the pool. She said this in the hesitant, throaty whisper she had adopted as her natural voice. I was accustomed to this affectation by now, and usually found it restful in the midst of all the jittery chatter about me. But at that point, it disturbed me as much as the invitation. I'm sorry, I said, some other time, and I meant it. I simply wasn't ready.
Those passages, or that passage, is fabulous for lots of things, not least of which is listening to Kilik's voice and the way in which she notices things, or her ability to do the details in the women's lounge at the St. Anthony, where you get this sort of rich detail of what mermaids and cacti, like it's crazy on the one hand, and yet it's got a verisimilitude that I suspect that was what it was, right? That this is just coming out of memory in some ways, and just beautifully done. And also the tent. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I looked online to see if by happenstance I could find a photograph of that bathroom.
Yeah.
I'm certain that it was exactly like that. And I suspect if we went deep into the archives, we would be able to find some sort of photographic or a newspaper cartoon or, something like that. But I didn't have the wherewithal to really do that.
No, but you don't need to either in some ways, because it is so rich. And also the, as you said at the very outset, that first person voice, reading another person, both characters, yes, but reading another person, and the way in which even that affectation of voice and the turn of the body, it just jumps off of the page. I remember reading that, the first time through in manuscript and going, I'd not read anything like this.
Yeah. So now might be a good time for me to tell the story of how I.
Yeah, well, that's where I want to go.
I'm holding up the volume 1 of the manuscript. I don't have the second volume here. So it's a rather extraordinary story. It's especially amazing to me. I mean, this is the kind of discovery that if you had once in a lifetime as a scholar, you would feel like you'd been blessed, right? This is really
right.
Extraordinary. With a comic twist, I'll just add that one of the things that I teach is the 18th century novel, and there's actually something in French in that period called a roman tiroir, or a drawer novel, so as to speak. It's the fictional premise that there's an editor who found a manuscript in a drawer. And obviously, to find myself in that situation in real life was pretty amazing. So I only met Margaret once before she died. This was in 2001. I'd moved to New York at the beginning of that academic year. I survived my first year as an assistant professor at Columbia, just about. And my mother was in a relationship, later a marriage, with a really lovely guy called Jim Kilik. And my mother kept on saying to me, you have to meet Jim's parents. They're just so great. And, I sort of took it with a grain of salt, like, how great can they be? But in fact, they were extraordinarily great. So I just met Margaret that one time, but and she died just a few months after that. But over the almost 20 years that followed, I got to know Gene incredibly well. Yeah. He was also a person with literary aspirations. He'd wanted to be a playwright in his youth, but duty called, and he went into the family leather business, which was in New York, New Jersey, and ran that, and had a very interesting, varied career. not just running that company, but also as a representative and then ultimately the president of the U.S. Tanners Association,
Wow.
doing deals all over the world,
Right.
including a fascinating trip that he recounted in a handwritten diary of going to China not that long after Nixon's trip to China, and ending up, because they were distinguished representatives of a trade, you know, an important trade from the U.S., being put up in some of the same hotel suites and so forth that had all been done up, you know, a year or two earlier for Nixon's entourage. So I was very, very close with Gene. He died a couple of years ago in his 90s, but, you know, about a year and a half before he died, he moved out of the loft in Soho that he and Margaret had spent a good deal of time living in. A house in New Jersey and a loft in Soho. Margaret rented this loft. It was on Green Street, 130 Green Street. Margaret rented this loft, I think in the 70s, because she wanted to run it as a gallery. It wasn't like the conventional pied-à-terre that someone, like people like Jean had a wife who might want a pied-à-terre on the Upper East Side or something like that. Right. Those were the days when Soho was really such an extraordinary neighborhood with burned out cars and huge homeless population and rats running across the floor of the loft and so forth. So it was a really amazing place, but the freight elevator, which was the main way up and down, needed to be replaced. And Gene was in his 90s and was having some health difficulties. So essentially, he finally had to give in to force majeure and move into more like a retirement home kind of a place. So I got these 3 huge bags of papers, big Sam's Warehouse, BJ's Warehouse, like huge plastic bags, just absolutely full of what were mostly Gene's literary manuscripts. Wow. He'd had a spell in the 1980s where he just retired, and he was clearly really trying to teach himself to be a professional, you know, fiction writer. About 30 short stories, many of which he sent out to submit for publication. Tragically, none were accepted. There's a little bit of correspondence. It's really moving. You know, manuscripts of novels. They're redolent of their era because they're all printed on what I know you remember and I remember, but many of our audience may not remember, which is to say that dot matrix paper that was kind of like attached to itself and had the little holes along the side. You know, it's so distinctive if you've ever known it. So huge piles of papers, and they sat in my living room for some months. Again, you're an academic, you know what I mean when I say, I think that they came to me in December or January, and it really wasn't till the end of the school year that I said, okay, this is taking up quite a large cubic volume in my living room, and it really would be good if I would do something about it. I really can't just let it sit here. So I started sorting through to figure out what was there. I did end up writing a nice little sort of pamphlet that reprinted a couple of Gene's short things and an essay about our friendship, our relationship. But in this huge pile of the dot matrix, you know, printouts, there was something that was just clearly physically anomalous. I'm going to hold up the volume again. Do you see? I really fetishize these old school office supplies. Totally. This is the Duo Tang folder. Again, I worked in offices in the late 80s. In a period where we still used a lot of these with these sort of slide through things. The typing paper is the Eaton Erasable Bond. It's got a kind of onion skin feel, and there are lots of typos. It was done on a not sophisticated typewriter with no correction ribbon, and nothing like that. So I saw on the front, the Duchess of Angus by Margaret Kilik, Reddington Road, White House Station, New Jersey. That's how we're dating the composition of the book to the late 50s. It was just around 1960 that Jean and Margaret moved to a different house in New Jersey. So we know that we can anchor, you know, the period that was written, and very little information otherwise about it. And I started to read, and within a few pages, my heart was pounding with excitement. Wow. And yes, I feel like that about a lot of I love novels. You know what I mean? I do often. I'm breathless, you know, as I read a new novel by a writer that I love. But in this case, what I was just staggered by was that this wasn't just a kind of a talented amateur, you know, fooling around and teaching themselves to be a good writer. This was a novel that had been written by somebody with a real vision for the world and sensibility that can be conveyed by language. So I was very excited right away. And by the time I finished reading it, I was just absolutely sure that it was going to be publishable. And
wow.
there are a couple.
What jumped at you?
So it's two things. The reason that I wouldn't let it drop was this extraordinary first person voice. I really feel it's a literary work that needed to be available for people to read. But the other reason is a little bit more contingent and very fortunate in this case, which is that the historical value of this autobiographical first person narrative is very, very strong on a number of different fronts. So first of all, there's the vividness with which wartime San Antonio is realized. That is exceptional. But also, as we've already kind of begun to talk around, the ways that it paints a picture of certain aspects of a certain kind of a young woman in a certain social class, white, but bohemian educated, not really enfranchised in terms of money or wealth or a clear status in society. What it shows us about women's lives in both of the generations, and what it tells us about young women's sort of sexual lives and sexual imaginings just seemed to me a genuine kind of historical contribution. So it was those three counts. There's the historical portrait of San Antonio. There's what we learn about women's emotional lives and sexual lives in this particular milieu. And then there's that literary merit that makes everything, 100 times more valuable. So I was pretty certain that the San Antonio, let me take that a little slower. I felt not just fortunate that I'd found this book, but that my own history as a writer and editor and faculty member had perfectly positioned me to understand what I needed to do with this. Right. So my novels have been published with all different kinds of press. Probably still my happiest experience with a publishing house was with Soft Skull Press, who published my first novel, a little indie press, 15 years ago now. And I'm relatively aware of what that kind of indie publishing landscape looks like. And I knew that, for instance, there are university presses that publish fiction. Not a ton of them, not a ton of fiction, but that this particular book, especially because of the Texas connection, was something that I thought I could really make a case for. And I do a lot of reader reports and so forth for university presses. I'm on the publication board at Columbia University Press. I'm involved in that world. It was the easiest pitch I have ever written. It wrote itself. Like, I sat down and it came off my fingers. It was really amazing. So it also just helped that I kind of knew where to start and where to ask. I talked to a small press publisher in San Antonio who pointed out the true and obvious and important thing that, given that all I had was this typescript, it really would need to be in the format of a typed Word document before publisher would be able to look at it. So I thought, okay, I can make that happen. I was very busy that year, so I was able to hire a great friend of mine, Mimi Lipson, who's a writer, who's a fiction and creative nonfiction writer herself, to type it and do a kind of preliminary cleanup of stuff. I did a little more work on it myself. And then I started reaching out to individual editors. And the first place I tried, I don't know that little, I don't know Texas history publishing, at all. Like, that's far from my field of expertise. So I wrote to an editor at the University of Texas at Austin Press. It looked from their website like maybe they published some fiction, not exactly, but there was the series editor that I wrote to, and he wrote me back right away. This was all going so much better than when I tried to publish my first novel as a assistant professor with no name. Like, I was like, thank
Yes.
the Lord.
Yeah.
Like if there's one thing that being professionally established is useful for, is that
It's
when you
very
get your
useful.
mind on something, people will actually pay attention to you. So
Yeah.
I was very aware of the privilege
Yeah.
that I was going into this with. So got a response back immediately from editors saying, that sounds like a riveting book. Unfortunately, we really publish no original fiction anymore.
No,
We publish
Yeah.
Latin American fiction in translation. We do a few other
Right.
things. We really don't. However, I know a wonderful editor at Trinity University Press. Her name is Marguerite Avery, and
Yeah.
I strongly recommend that you should write to her. So I redid the little top part of my pitch, making sure that I didn't have any
Yes.
glitches in it, you know, and I sent it to Margie. And again, within 24 hours, it was a miracle. She wrote back to me sounding very excited too. And
Good.
so that relationship was immediately very strong. And
Yeah.
I've just been delighted to be able to work with Margie and her colleagues
Yeah.
at Trinity.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful press, as you know.
Yeah, no, it's fabulous. And
They're the perfect press to do this.
No,
book.
I think that's
there
right.
Could not have been better.
I think that's right. But I mean, look at the transition from a garbage bag
Oh yeah.
to a novel, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
dip in, I mean, just the sort of editorial notion of you dipping into this bag and out comes these things that are not
Yeah.
like other things, right? And
Yeah.
suddenly your heart is pounding.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I want to let the folks who are on with us, if you have a question, if you would use the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of your screen, about really midpoint in the screen, and shoot us questions, and I will read them out, and Jenny can answer them, because as you have heard already, she is a good talker. She's got a good sense of how to respond. So please do send us some commentary, and we will address it. The storyline and the backstory for me is almost as fascinating as the novel itself, right? And then actually they're paired in some ways, right? It's discovery and how one goes about producing great works of fiction, as this one is. I need to sort of diverge for a moment to ask you about Broken Things. Like, how are we going to talk about the ruins of Rome after you've talked about the jumpiness of San Antonio? What's the connection?
It's funny, I do realize sort of at midlife how much I'm drawn to books that are about cities. If I think of every novel that I've written has been a novel of a neighborhood in a city, London, Edinburgh, New York, you know, I'm really drawn to that. And so as an 18th century scholar, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is something I've always loved. And
Yes.
I thought, I really want to figure out how to write a book about it. And I was, again, I'm living such an incredibly fortunate academic life. It really, I feel guilty often because, as we know, it's so hard for people who work in academia now. So many people aren't hired on full-time contracts or don't have any resources and are very, very overloaded with teaching and service. However, I was lucky enough to fall into one of these very, very fortunate positions. And Columbia actually has a wonderful short-term fellowship that they give in conjunction with the American Academy in Rome.
Oh, already I'm very jealous.
Yeah, so I had 6 weeks where I was able to go and live in the American Academy in Rome, which is on the Janiculum Hill. And it's really like going and living in a Henry James novel. It's like grand 19th century, you know,
Palazzo?
A tower on a hill. It's a palazzo on a hill. I mean, it's really, it's a whole complex. And just to dig in the knife even further, there's an adorable little, you know, classic Italian kind of bar and dining room, and the food is cooked by a team that it's the Rome Sustainable Food Project, and Alice Waters was the founder of it. It's all, you know, kind of local and seasonal, seasonal food and stuff. So I found myself as following a sort of project or path in Rome that's not unlike what you have described as Jane's path in San Antonio, which is to say, I'm not a great traveler and I don't speak Italian. I got there, it was overwhelming. Like the whole 6 weeks I was there, I was just overwhelmed, and I made myself do those explorations
Good.
and visit those places
Good.
and anchor my knowledge of the city in having really walked around streets and
Excellent.
gone to places
Excellent.
and so forth.
Yeah.
So that was 3 years ago. So that was the initial core research experience, which I was doing as I was finishing. Decline and Fall is about 1.5 million words long. So
At least.
my reread project took about 3 months. I would sort of do a chapter a day. Of course, some of the chapters are quite short and some of them are extremely long, especially as you get later into the history. But I guess for me, both in fiction and in academic writing, it's that sort of full imaginative entry into a past place, like an absent place that you make present in language that I could keep on coming back to. Like, it's just, it has a really strong hold on me.
Yeah. So there's 2 questions that are not unlike that process, one of which, both from good San Antonians who wondered, one about when you did that same walk around for San Antonio, was there a highlight that sort of jumped out at you, some moment where you went, oh my God, I now get this place, or something along those lines? And the other of which actually has to do with the title, The Duchess of Angus. Like,
okay, great.
Talk to us about those 2 things.
For the second, I'll read the passage in the novel where we get that explanation.
Good.
Let me say, with shame to the first, I was there for such a short time, and I'm really, when I say I'm not a good traveler, I'm not a good traveler. The one thing that I did that was so lovely was do my early morning runs along the Riverwalk, which was absolutely amazing. I mean, that's an incredible, again, you forget, if you're not a runner, you forget how many American hotels in cities or not in cities are actually not really located where you can safely go out for a run and not get hit by a car, or, like whatever it is. So, so that I think is my strongest physical memory of the place, and I hope that I get to come back and do that again. But really, the most amazing thing was this visit that we had. Margaret had 2 younger half-brothers who were kind of the figure in the book he's older half-brother, and he's kind of a composite of those 2 younger brothers, I rapidly realized. So the widow and the children of one of those younger brothers still live in San Antonio. So I had an amazing trip. My editor, Margie, came with me. It was really one of the most wonderful days that I can ever remember, where we went over to Jennifer Denslow's house. She is the daughter of Della Daniels, who was Margaret's sister-in-law. And Jennifer was there, and her brother Tim was there, Tim's wife Kelly. And we essentially just sat there, and I had imagined that I was gonna, we were gonna socialize, and then I would switch to interview mode. And I neurotically had specially bought another digital recorder in case my phone didn't, like I was all prepared.
Prepared, totally.
But of course, as soon as we walked in the door, Della started reminiscing, and it was just, I don't know what not like the flies and the spider, because that's the wrong connotation at all, but we were woven into the web of storytelling that Della had. And it was immediately clear to me that I would completely break the rapport if I tried to get her to stop and start again and do the tape recorder. So I instead fumbled for, a notebook and a pencil and scribbled down as fast as I could to get all of the details. So these stories, but the stories that Della had and especially that Tim had, he was, I think, the oldest of the nephews and nieces, or at any rate, he had a long-standing relationship with Margaret, and he remembered lots of great stories, both about Margaret and her visits, but also about this extraordinary character, Agnes, who loomed very large over that whole family's lives. So it's really the stories that I heard from family members that I think are the most precious thing about that visit.
Wonderful. I've got a third question, but let's go to the title.
Yeah, let me read this passage. So yes, it is a funny title, The Duchess of Angus. I love the title. I think it's brilliant, Jane Davis is jokingly called the Duchess by her half-brother because she seems to carry herself as if she's above and apart from the rest of the crowd. The Angus is the name of the hotel that Jane's mother is running. And now I will read the scene that lays out that history. My mother claimed that the Angus Hotel was the third oldest building in the city, next to the Alamo and the Governor's Palace. When she first came to San Antonio, she carried on a sizzling correspondence with the Historical Society, arguing the point. But in the end, she wore them down, just as she did everyone else. The only time she ever lost an argument was when she was battling with the Angelus Funeral Home. And then she only conceded the point for her own convenience. At that time, the hotel was called the Angelus, a name which my mother considered quite appropriate because of the proximity to a cathedral whose bells tolled morning, noon, and night. It summons tired wanderers off the streets, she would say to Lily Duloc when they were sitting over a sentimental beer. Then it did not matter that mail belonging to the Angelus Funeral Home was delivered to the Angelus Hotel and vice versa. There was nothing very important anyway. But when Jess, Jane's older half-brother, joined the Navy, mail became a very big item indeed. Feelings between the two establishments became strained, particularly on my mother's side. At one point, she openly accused them of keeping a picture postcard of the beach at Waikiki. It was Lily Duloc who suggested that my mother get the funeral home to change their name to something else. Nobody who goes there cares anyway, she said. She even offered them the use of her own name. They refused. If my mother had not been going out with a man from the slaughterhouse at the time, I think she would have put up with the inconvenience of chasing down her mail rather than lose a battle. But she was quite taken with her butcher. And when he suggested the Angus and offered to give her a new sign as a token of affection, she agreed. The building was old. The outer layer of adobe was dry and brittle. Lately, when there was an unusual ruckus in the streets, portions of the old mud would shake loose and crumble about us. This did not detract from the hotel's appearance. In fact, it became more picturesque after a severe jolt. Hardly a day went by when some amateur artist did not sit under the huizache tree in the back courtyard, studying with interest the beautiful ruin.
Wonderful.
So that's the end of the book. Let me just add one other amazing anecdote that was one of the great ones that I got from that day at Jennifer's house with all of the family members. So the portrait of the mother in the book, it really is exactly the real life Agnes. Like, it's very clear once I heard more stories. But one of the amazing anecdotes about her, she was feared perhaps more than she was loved, it might be said. You know, she was a really intimidating person, unusual. So she ran these hotels all over town. And in one of the hotels, she was very irked because the next door neighbors had a tree that was growing over her property. And I can't remember now what fruit or flower, but they were falling in her yard and it was creating a mess. So she badgered them to do something about it, and they did nothing. So in the end, she just went and got a stepladder and a saw, and she went up to the fence between the two properties, and she sawed off the whole part of the branch that came over on her side of the property, which did not lead to friendly relationships with the next door neighbors, as you might imagine. Yes,
never does. So we've got one more question. Actually, we got a couple more. And I want to read this one. It's from Patricia Patalis, and it's quite intriguing. Though Kilik creates only flat Mexican-American characters, her sense of their bicultural negotiation is strong. She writes, quote, "The Mexicans mentally threw up their hands and gave up the exhausting struggle of trying to imitate their conquerors, and later asked just who had conquered whom." This is on page 65. Do you think she was commenting on their marginalizations?
I do think that she was. And one of the, a sort of sense of a missed opportunity that the book has is that in many ways, this lead character, if you were going to come up with a sort of psychological explanation, you would say she does see these forms of marginalization, the great difficulties that the Mexican Americans are experiencing in this community, where there's a sort of entrenched white overclass who get a lot of the privilege and a lot of the good things that are going. And maybe the intensity with which she tries to distance herself from them, it's that of someone who is herself somewhat precarious or on the margins. So we can see it as a kind of anxiety around that that is coming through in this, persistent distancing.
Yeah, good. The final question I have is about the editing that you did. And we had talked about it yesterday a little bit about the, what do you call it, the scattershot commas that you had gone through and cleaned up. But William Mall wonders what was required. I mean, sort of as an editor, what did you have to do to sort of whip it into shape?
So this was where my academic self was somewhat at war with my novelistic self, or perhaps not even the case. I've always really loved these books, Jane Austen's Juvenilia, or that amazing short book called The Young Visitors, that's sort of like, whether real or faux, we don't really know. But, I love books that have eccentric spelling and constructions and so forth. And my initial sense was that part of in addition to the voice that's in the words, was that part of what was so compelling was this thing as an artifact, and these pages, with these typos and very consistent patterns of misspelling and sentence structures that weren't quite normalized and so forth. So especially because I was thinking university press, I thought maybe we really can do, a scholarly edition that's a facsimile that reproduces all of the errors of the text. So I loved that idea, but more powerful to me in the end was the idea that this novel deserved a true reader's edition. And one of the things that I love about the way that the press designed it is that although it is a book with an introduction and with 2 critical essays at the end, your essay about San Antonio and Laura's essay, both of which are really wonderful accompaniments to the book, although it's got that apparatus, it doesn't look or feel like a scholarly book.
Exactly right.
But everything about the typesetting and the book design, the format, it has the allure of a novel that you want to read. So I did need to sacrifice the idea that we could have a facsimile. It is my intention to deposit the original manuscripts in special collections archives at the library at Trinity. So it will be available there if anyone wants to look at it. We may be able to do a digital edition online, which would be great. But so I then had to step by step acknowledge that once you kind of correct or normalize spelling and punctuation, you then realize that there are glitches in verb tenses that you really need to kind of rectify. And then you realize that there are some more complicated things about how a scene moves from present to past that you need to do more editing. So I wouldn't say I was drag kicking and screaming, but I reluctantly gave in to the fact that this never did have professional edit in its own lifetime, and that it did need the kinds of professional editing that any novel that goes to a publisher now would get. In fact, even up to the copy edit stage, I had a really wonderful copy editor, Emily Jarman, who I believe works with Trinity Press pretty often. And she gave me an incredibly thoughtful set of copy edits where she'd really noticed all of the kind of lingering anomalies. Oh, wow. Places where something about the transition or the conjunction wasn't right. And it was those copy edits. She really did persuade me that now that we were committed to this idea of the book as a reading edition, that we needed to make it really a reading edition, not one of the, I read a lot of novels, and I do read some self-published fiction, and some of it is very, very good, but I do often notice when I'm reading a self-published book that there are, so to speak, the writing can be very lively, good storytelling, good characters, but there are often small glitches that if you're a professional writer or editor, you notice. And it is often a kind of like, it's conventional when you narrate a scene of dialogue between 2 people. It's really conventional. It's a rule that can be broken, but it's conventional to narrate the scene from the side of one character rather than, so to speak, motion sicknessy, jolt back. And that's the kind of thing you see a lot in self-published fiction. It's someone who just hasn't been exactly taught or, forced to accommodate their writing to that sort of convention. So there were things like that where, for ease of comprehension, it just made sense to do I was very respectful, and I was as restrained as I could possibly be. But in the end, yes, I think we did do quite a bit of editing.
Yeah, and one of the things that's in the book that I love is a map. And I raised that point because Erica Schoenberg, who works for the press, she was an intern last year. Yeah, so it's this gorgeous map. And she was an intern for the press, and she worked on Duchess a lot, as she says, especially tracking down locations for the map in the front. So she doesn't have a question. She just, there's this whole production around this book. And listening to you talk about the editing process reminds me of, you paint a room in the house or in an apartment, and all of a sudden everything else has to be painted.
It really was
because,
exactly that case. You look and you're like, gosh, that's looking pretty shabby now. We've got to do something about that too.
So if I'm going to clean up the tenses, maybe I need to clean up this, and then I need to clean up that. If there aren't any more questions, I want to say thank you so very much for this evening. And I've got some plugs for the press, so let me do that first. This is a monthly series by Trinity University Press, the Maverick Book Club is, and it features intriguing articles discussing books that are shaping the narrative landscape of Texas, and in particularly this year, as we heard, San Antonio. The next one will be June 10th, 7 o'clock Central Time, US. And we'll feature San Antonio 365 on this day in history, the David Martin Davies of Texas Public Radio, and Our Lady of the Lake Professor Yvette Benavides, moderated by Lily Gonzalez, who's the director of the San Antonio Book Festival, which unfortunately will not happen this spring. Otherwise, this book would have surely been featured there. But I do want to thank you so much, Jenny. This was a blast. Thank you to the many people who joined us today, I should say, for the conversation. And as one person shouted out, loved the cat that's walking behind us.
That's right. They're unpreventable. If I shut the door, they'd just be scrabbling at the door.
Absolutely.
So yes, thank you, Char. I hugely enjoyed this. Your history of San Antonio was one of the books that I found most useful as I was working on the introduction.
Wonderful.
And it's really, it's a privilege as well as a pleasure to have you here. And just thanks to everybody who's joined us for this conversation, and huge thanks to everybody who works at the press, our map intern,
Right, absolutely.
To Tom, to Bergen, especially to Margie, who's really just been a joy to work with.
Good. Thank you all.
Yes, have a good night.